Hey guys, tonight we are sinking quietly into the ground, down past sun-baked courtyards, through cool stone rings, into the hush of water that waited for whole villages to return with clay jars and braided ropes. If you enjoy this gentle, nerdy history that helps you drift off, tap subscribe so you can find your way back here any night you're thirsty for calm stories. A well thrives when a town learns to guide not only purity but impurity. Clean water is a discipline. Dirty water is an education. The ancients discovered that a city becomes graceful when it decides, gently and consistently, where the day's used water will walk. That decision seldom announces itself with triumph. It hides in small gradients of stone, in courtyards that slope a finger's width, in channels no wider than a palm, in drains that end in sand where no one drinks. The miracle of a sweet cup begins in the choreography of what is not kept. Streets were teachers. Their crowns rose slightly in the center and fell toward gutters that murmured after rain or laundry day. Stone setters learned a craft of millimeters. Here a camber that nudges water to the lane's edges. There are tight joints so a bucket's slosh cannot linger and invite slime. Where alleys approached a well's neighborhood. Paving changed character as a quiet border. Tighter joints, smoother faces. A subtle step that says lift your feet and your manners. Children learned the map with their knees. Traders learned it with their wheels. Even dogs adjusted their routes by the way the stone spoke to paws. Courtyards became laboratories of harmless endings. A jar stand sat near the kitchen door. Beside it, a shallow stone gutter led away from the stand and ended in a pocket of sand and roots. Basil, thyme, a forgiving figure. Rinses went first to plants. Soaps went to a separate corner where suds could collapse into soil without returning to anyone's tea. In houses with cisterns, the spigot stood above a lip that caught the last drips and encouraged them to become mint. In houses with well water, the dipper lived under a lid and never crossed paths with the wash ladle. A stone bench kept buckets off the ground so their bottoms did not learn dust by heart, work that dirties, tanning, dyeing, brewing, washing hides, cleaning fish, moved downwind and downslope as a habit so steady it became instinct. Tanneries wrapped their vats in roofs that scolded splashes. Dye pots sat on platforms whose overflow ran into settling pits where color could sleep as sediment instead of running laughing into the gutter. Even a careless paw learned a short sermon from gravity. Here, a lip. There, a catch. Next, a channel to a soak. Endings, not accidents. Market by market, craft by craft, towns learned to translate activity into flows that did not collide with thirst. Latrines kept their distance like polite cousins. In lane houses, privies faced a small, lined pit whose bottom was honest sand rather than a hungry crack that might speak to an aquifer. The pit was covered in order and emptied in season. The path to it was swept in the late afternoon so flies had fewer reasons to brag. In denser quarters, cesspits wore collars of brick and clay and lived beneath trap lids of wood and stone. Ash and earth were added daily to teach smell humility and to keep the surface from welcoming vermin. None of this was glamorous. All of it was kindness applied to materials. Public life had its own circuits. Laundry stones stood where a drain could carry suds to a herb bed and not to the well shadow. Animal troughs kept their runoff in their own family. Fountains wore low rails so buckets could not arrogantly dip where cups were meant to sip. Bathhouses, lavish with water in generous years, spare in lean ones, returned their grey water to gardens or fields, not to the square. Where aqueducts delivered a river's shoulder to a city's lip. The outflows walked a second life along gutters that fed trees and washed cobbles before the water left town with a little less dust than it found. Storms rehearsed the plan at speed. Before the big rains, roof gutters were swept with brooms that had names. First flush jars waited with their patient mouths ready to swallow the season's memory of pollen and smoke. Street gratings were cleared and their baskets emptied. Children loved this solemn task because it felt like adult mischief sanctioned. When the sky finally spoke in water, a city that had practiced watched happiness travel in tidy lines. Down tile, across gutter, into jar, under lid. Down lane, along curb, into drain, under field. The few minutes of muddy exuberance after the first roar calmed quickly. The well kept its hat on and its temper stable, Wells and cisterns taught arithmetic by location. A cesspit that sits here does not speak to a well that sits there. A kitchen that nests upwind sings to a cistern that sleeps below. A dye shop that grins out by the east gate cannot whisper into a fountain that smiles in the west square. These are small geometries that add up to public health without the need to name it. When a town rebuilt after fire or flood, the map improved itself by memory. That alley turned a fraction. That drain lengthened a hand. That trough found a better angle. The improvements look like luck to strangers and like good manners to citizens. Maintenance was the everyday hero of these wasteways. Brushes lived on hooks. Scoops lived by gratings. Buckets were marked for rinse only or for soap and never for soup. After market close, stalls swept toward the gutter, then away from the well. A little procession of baskets carried peels and stems to goats or to compost heaps that smoked gently and felt like a small farm in miniature. On festival nights, when lanterns made a carnival of corners and feet forgot to be careful, dawn crews walked the map with a forgiving eye. The well's bench, the fountain's lip, the curb's tidy slope, each was returned to its baseline by hands that preferred order to speeches. Not every town learned early. Some learned after a bad season. A fever moved through, and people counted its steps back to a sloppy habit. No more rinsing knives near the rim, the warden wrote on the slate. No more dye pots without collars, the guild agreed. No more halfway pits, the mason said, and his new pits wore brick shirts that hugged them tight. The memory of error turned into a road of better choices. Even tales softened into tools. A rumor about a careless man at the lip became, in the retelling, a parable about lids and separate dippers. Fear, trained into caution, became civility. Plants conspired as helpers. Vines were trained where downspouts met courtyards, so splash soothed into leaves. Time took drops by habit and returned them as scent on fingers. Reeds lined soakaways and taught detergent to lose its sharpness. Little willow beds drank laundry water at the town's edge and offered baskets in return. A narrow trench filled with rounded stones became a plot's invisible lungs, breathing away what a kitchen did not need, returning a soil that smiled at seed. These were not grand wetlands. They were pocket versions, house scale, alley scale, testaments to the idea that endings can be purposeful. Die-end places with rivers. The unkind temptation was to throw the day's untidiness into the moving mirror and forget. Kinder towns used the river as a tutor. Rinsing corners stood downstream from drinking places. The fishmongers' platforms sat where tide argued in their favor. Dyers kept their indigo in vats with patience, letting pigment settle so that the pour could be clean. A city that faces water faces itself. Those that learned to be shy of the river's opinion found themselves praised by their own breakfasts. The tea tasted like stone and gratitude, not like gossip. Modern pipes hid much of this choreography, but not its logic. Sewer lines became the long, deep versions of alley drains. Grease traps replaced herb beds. Leach fields replaced soak pockets. Manholes replaced gratings. Yet when a storm floods a street or a pump naps unexpectedly, the old habits show their worth. Someone still brushes the curb toward the drain. Someone still lifts a grate. Someone still says not here when a bucket thinks about mischief near a well's descendant, a public tap, a bottle filler, a school sink. Infrastructure changes costumes. Manners stay in character. Dirty dusk, after chores, you can sit near a well and notice the absence that good wasteways achieve. No sourness on the air, only the mineral kindness of stone. No slick near the lip, only a dry crescent where the rope used to kiss and now the roller watches. No flies rehearsing chaos, only a moth near the lantern. The quiet speaks. The day's water went where it should. It fed what wanted feeding and ended where it did not trouble any cup. Somewhere a small channel carries a last, modest ribbon toward a patch of time. The town sleeps, and the well dreams of nothing, a very good dream. Most days a well is unremarkable on purpose, a steady voice in the background that keeps soup honest and tempers low. But in the rare hours when a town is tested, by siege, by fire, by the sudden churn of many feet, wells step forward from the quiet and become the hinge on which survival turns. Communities that planned for calm discovered that the same habits, tended carefully, could widen into courage when the world grew noisy. Under siege, a well learns to be a vault. Lids are locked. The keeper's key becomes a necklace under a shirt, warm with breath and responsibility. Drawers are moved inside the rhythm of watch bells, short, scheduled, counted. The rope song changes, slower and lower, and the square, usually social, becomes purposeful. The first discipline is distance. Latrines deeper downhill, kitchen fires shielded so Ish doesn't wander, animal troughs stepped farther out with a stone lip to rebuke splashback. The second is schedule. Soldiers at dawn and dusk, bakers after dawn when heat can be put to double work, households by alleys in the brief, supervised midday. The third is silence. No shouting at the lip, no metal on stone, because sound travels oddly under tension and you cannot waste it. Siege invents redundancy. A covered cistern that once felt like luxury becomes certainty. Cool, dark, its mouth guarded by a ledger of hours. Rain barrels under eaves, kept out of the sun in easy years, now stand with a dignity beyond their size. The bathhouse sleeps. Its share is reassigned to field dressings and gruel. The watercourt's clepsydra, a domestic instrument yesterday, becomes law today. Children learn a shy pride in counting drips. When the bowl sinks, your family's turn. When it sinks again, your neighbor's. No one argues with the bowl because it has no favorites. Fire asks for the opposite tempo, fast hands, loud warnings, and still the well remains the center. In places that knew flames as a seasonal guest, long ladders and leather buckets slept near the mouth under a linter like spears standing in peace. When a bell strikes the fire note, the town reassembles into chains. 2 lines, one to the well, one to the flames, buckets passing hand to hand with a rhythm that belongs to ropes and rowing. A good chain has music. Lift, pass, return, lift, pass, return. Someone watches the lip and wipes the coping so slop doesn't smear grit into the rope and cut it at the worst moment. Someone else keeps lids for backups, cistern, trough, barrel, so that no mouth stands uncovered longer than it must. The smallest hands fill cups for the chain's throats. The eldest stand at corners to direct feet away from the new danger of smoke. The well's architecture shows its foresight in these hours. A broad platform lets many feet dance without jostle. The roller's axle, kept oiled in ordinary months, doesn't shriek for attention now. A second rope sits ready on a peg. A second bucket waits, its hoop already tested. The stone around the mouth slopes outward so spill flees the lip. The trough's runnels are shaped to lead overflow to a sacrificial strip of ground that can wet itself into a firebreak. These are small choices made long ago, rewarded today with ease that looks like luck. Not all emergencies announce themselves with bells. Sometimes it is a fever that warms a street unevenly. Sometimes, a rumor that chills it. In these quieter alarms, the well extends its manners rather than unrolling new laws. Separate dippers multiply. A cup for the infirm, boiled each evening. Another for the cautious, wiped with a vinegar cloth that smells like a clean garden. The lid is lifted with a pause to let the keeper look into faces and read the day. The warden's slate at the shelter grows more talkative. Draw gently, silt high after storm, boil for infants this week, cistern sweet, prefer for tea. The slate does not preach. It invites adult participation, turning worry into chores. Floods, the inverse of siege, tempt waste and conceal danger. Water everywhere can be dirtier than water nowhere, and so the well is protected from the world's rush the way a heart is protected from a bruise. Sandbags or planks form a short ring wall. A canvas skirt hangs to shed muddy sheet flow away from a coping. The lid is weighted, not only against debris but against buoyancy. Floodwater is rude and will try to lift what it shouldn't. When the water goes, the well does not open immediately. Drawdown and scrubbing happen first. The first buckets given to paths and gardens, the brushes working the throat while a soft song keeps the pace. The return to service is a ceremony. The keeper tastes. The eldest tastes. Then the slate says, simply, clear. There are darker hours that practice cannot banish. Accident. Malice, the single irresponsible act that tests neighbor's faith. A dye pot poured in hurry. A drunk who thought himself funny. a soldier with orders that smelled like spite. Here the choreography is procedure. Lids closed, witnesses gathered, draw down to waist, inspection by 2 and not 1, cleaning sworn to the slate, then a patient refill by rain or cistern. The rumour that would have multiplied in shadow dies under the bright boredom of steps followed. The well's dignity survives because the town chose process over drama. Emergency also exposes kindness that the ordinary day hides. In siege, the last jar from the hour often finds its way to the widow's doorstep. In fire, someone shields the carrier's hands with strips of wet cloth so his grip will not slip and his palms will not pay too dear. In flood, a child is taught to ladle not because she is strong, but because she will remember this specific stewardship when she is older. After the danger, the square puts on a shy festival of mending. Rope reversed end to end, roller re-oiled, hoops tapped, brush bristles trimmed, slate washed, chalk sharpened. People speak of other matters while the work continues. The well is thanked without speeches. Modern versions of these pressures rhyme even when they change costumes. A neighborhood with taps and hydrants still needs human choreography. Who turns what valve? Who opens which spigot? Who checks the bottled stock at the clinic? Who posts the update that says boil notice until Friday? Solar pumps have their own sieges, cloudy weeks, and the backup hand pump must not be a museum piece. Emergency bladders and collapsible tanks are just cisterns in new fabrics. The habit that keeps them clean is the old habit with a different LID-AT night. After the siren sleeps and the rope hangs loose again, the well returns to being a listener. You can sit nearby, cup in hand, and hear the residue of the day leave your chest. The coping is cool. The lid fits. The bench remembers the weight of many feet and does not complain. It is difficult to be afraid in the presence of such ordinariness restored. The well's greatest trick is not to be heroic during crisis, but to make calm feel inevitable afterward. The lesson of emergencies is that resilience is just maintenance performed at speed. Keep the lid and the ledger. Keep the spare rope and the second bucket. Keep the habits that prevent slop and favour quiet. Then, when bells ring or rumours run, the village already knows the choreography. Thirst will find not chaos but a practiced kindness, and the well, settled, steady, will give as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Where water gathers, stories gather. Some arrive to help, quiet instructions turned into habits, while others arrive in seasons of worry and cling like ivy to the coping. Wells sat at the centre of villages not only as sources of drink but as mirrors for the mood of a year. In generous times, they were meeting places and song starters. In anxious times, plague years, war years, drought years, they also became accusation stages and altars of precaution. To keep a well healthy, communities learned to tend both the water and the tales that surrounded it. The oldest warnings are practical wrapped in poetry. Do not let the moon look too long, says a grandmother, meaning, keep the lid on, for light invites algae and insects. Do not let your shadow fall first, says an uncle, meaning, steady your hands, pour from the jar before leaning in. Don't startle the surface with careless reach. These phrases made children careful long before they could name microbes. A blue glass bead tied to the lid handle watched the mouth the way a warden does. A bronze charm kept as much gossip away as it did evil. The bead wasn't magic. The attention it demanded was in crowded centuries. Fear sometimes outran sense, and Wells caught the rumour like a cold. A stranger near the rim, a cluster of fevers. And suddenly a story grew legs. Someone has thrown powder. Someone has stirred poison with a stick. Communities learned. Painfully, that panic makes poor engineers. The antidote wasn't to ignore fear but to domesticate it. Lids were locked at night, not as a barricade against imagined villains alone, but because good lids keep dust, leaves, and stray paws out. Keepers signed for keys. The opening and closing became visible rituals with a broom, a lamp, a nod, a choreography that reminded everyone the well had guardians. Not merely hopes, real protections multiplied, very small and very steady. Separate dippers kept purposes apart, a short-handled one for drinking that could not reach far enough to stir sediment, a longer-handled one for washing basins at a distance, a third for animals at the trough, which stood downwind and downslope so enthusiasm never splashed back into anyone's tea. First draws after a storm were spared for the garden, letting grit settle before anyone's cup met the clear middle. The topmost stones, the coping, were wiped each morning. Not because they were filthy, but because clean surfaces announce their own care and make mischief feel out of place. When illness travelled through streets, rules became kinder and stricter at once. A fevered household drew from a dedicated jar. The shared dipper was boiled at sundown. The bench was wiped with an infusion that smelled like a garden. Strong tea, vinegar with herbs, both a mild cleanser and a public sign that care was underway. The well's mouth was given a day of dignity, lids on a little longer, draws slower and fewer, the surface left untroubled to settle. People waited. Patience filtered what buckets couldn't. You could hear it in the rope song, fewer pulls, more listening, and the square breathed a quieter rhythm that soothed nerves as much as it preserved hygiene. There were, too, the gentle superstitions that harmed no one and helped plenty. A small bell on the lid rang if someone lifted in the odd hours, its chime less an alarm than a courtesy that attracted eyes. A painted eye stared from the shelter's beam, an emblem against envy that also reminded everyone, the well is watched. At dusk, a lantern burned in the keeper's niche one night each week regardless of season, a little light that said, "We remember." These ornaments didn't purify water. They purified attention, turning protection from an occasional chore into a shared identity. Boundaries did the most honest work. The well's neighborhood was carved invisibly into zones of yes and no. Yes, jars on a stand. A cloth under buckets. A drip channel that leads to time. No, rinsing knives. Dyeing cloth. Washing fish. The no's were not scolds. They were translations of physics into habit. Soap slicks and protein scraps want to travel. Gravity helps them. Not here interrupted that journey. In market squares, a low rail or a chain of stones made this border tangible. In lanes, a pattern in the paving told feet where to pause. Children absorbed the map by play. Hopscotch squares stopped before the coping. Occasionally, malice was real. A rival poured bitterness into a town by whispering rather than dosing. A soldier, drunk and thoughtless, tossed something unkind. Communities answered with procedure before passion. Draw down to the troughs and gardens. Scrub the lining with soft brushes. Let the well rest. Bring water from a different source, cistern, spring, for a day or two. Tell the story in daylight, not at doorways. In this way, suspicion did not metastasize into blame, and the well re-entered service with dignity rather than drama. People remembered that clarity is a process, the visible kind, with hands and rope and time, not a miracle announced by anger. Architecture helped. Some wells hid their true mouths behind small porches. A decoy curb stood where a vandal would most likely aim a mischief, while the Real drawer happened to pace aside under a shuttered opening. In cities with long memories of siege, wellheads sat inside courtyards with a second door. You could drink as a citizen, but not as a marauder in a hurry. Grills protected pulley beams from tampering. Little lock plates turned out of sight like eyelids. None of it felt like a fortress. It felt like respect expressed as detail. Guilds and wardens kept ledgers that calmed rumor before it ripened. A slate on the shelter listed the last cleaning day. A notch on a beam marked a new rope start. A chalk circle worn larger with each maintenance round told anyone who cared to look that someone had indeed been here and done it. In some districts, an evening round walked the well circuit, fountain, cistern, standpipes, touching lids, listening for trickles that shouldn't be, rapping a coping stone to hear the ring that means sourness. The walk was not a patrol so much as a lullaby sung to infrastructure. People slept better knowing it was sung. Stories softened, too, when people had something better to tell. Every well collects kindness. A bride who poured the first ladle for an old woman. A child who, when asked to fetch, returned with a full jar and a folded note for a neighbour who could not leave her bed. A travelling tinker who repaired a hinge and refused payment, saying he had drunk here 20 years ago on a hard afternoon. As these tales accumulated, They competed successfully with the darker ones. A square rich in gratitude does not starve on rumour. Modern protections look different but rhyme. A lockable cap replaces the wooden lid. A simple test kit replaces the vinegar cloth. A sign at a park fountain, bottle only. No pets, descends from the old Trophade distance rule. Cameras sometimes do what bells once did. Yet the best defence remains visibility and care shared in daylight. A schedule posted, a phone number answered, a human face who can say, "We cleaned this morning." Draw with confidence. Panic hates specifics. Wells love them. At night, when only the cat and the late walker pass, the Wells circle holds its quiet. If you listen, you can hear the tiny sounds of protection continuing on their own. A lid settling as the air cools. A rope's twist relaxing. A drop finding a stone channel and giving the time a sip. In the morning the square will wake, and with it the old choreography, rinse dipper. Clean mat, careful pour, will start again. Seasoned by warnings that turn into wisdom and myths that turn into manners. The lesson is not to banish fear but to train it into guardianship. Tie the bead, ring the bell, lock the lid, write the slate, scrub the coping. Keep dippers separate, keep animals honoured at their own basin, keep stories honest and public. Then a well will hold not only water but calm, and the village will drink not only for thirst but for reassurance, sips that say, "We looked after this together, and it will look after us." On an island, thirst has a different accent. It speaks with the breath of the sea and carries a little salt in its jokes. Wells here are cautious things. They know that, a few shovels too deep, the mouth will taste brackish and the tongue will complain. So islanders learn two parallel crafts. The art of catching sky in tanks and the art of listening for freshwater where rock meets tide, those shy coastal springs that arrive as if they were smuggling kindness. Ashore rain tanks are the islanders' pantry. Roofs become faithful servants, whitewashed to rebuff heat, mended quickly so that a tear today does not become a season's waste. Gutters are wide enough to forgive a palm frond and narrow enough to keep out a wandering crab. Before the first storm, brooms come out like ritual objects. Children race along eaves with laughter that shakes dust free. First flush jars own the muddled beginning of a rain, and after their cloudy cup is offered to herbs, the clean middle is welcomed beneath. Tanks sit under shade, a mango if you have it, a trellis of vine if you don't, wearing lids that fit like well-cut hats. The dark inside is curated gently, a mesh on the inlet, a small baffle to quiet the fall. A tap set just above the sediment sleeping bed, and, once a year, a day of scrubbing that the whole household remembers in their wrists. Because the wind is a gossip, every opening is polite. Screens turn away insects without turning away air. A tiny vent lets the tank sigh and prevents the vacuum that makes a tap cough. Buckets have manners. They never kiss bare sand. They rest on a stone or a board, and their bottoms are rinsed before they go back to meet the tap. The sound of a tank in good health is a cushion rather than an echo. The knock of knuckles on its side returns a calm note, not a hollow ring. In the hot hour after midday, the lid is lifted with quiet ceremony, and the first glass poured tastes almost like the brief cool at a wave's retreat. Coastal springs are tricksters who grew honest. They seep where a lens of rainwater, trapped in island rock, feels brave enough to meet daylight at the shore. Islanders learn to read them the way fishermen read birds, a damp stripe on stone at low tide, a patch of limp seaweed where the rest stands crisp, the way a hermit crab lingers as if unsure whether this is ocean or not. Springs are corded with small architecture, stone lips laid against the rock to make a pocket, a notch and a sluice to separate the sweet from the brine, a wooden spout tucked under a ledge so that the first trickle falls into a jar rather than onto sand. At low tide, the water runs truest. At high tide, patience wins. Children are taught this tide grammar long before they can name the moon. Islands organize around these quiet sources. A tank belongs to a house. A spring belongs to a lane or a cove. Morning sees a line of jars and gossip. Evening sees a few last careful pours for soup and tea. Animals drink uphill at their own basin. The spring's lip is kept for cups and for mothers rinsing a cloth. No soap, no dye. No rinsing of nets where the twine might drag sand into sweetness. Nets have their own stone further down, where salt belongs and fish stories enjoy it. Maintenance is beachwork with librarian manners. Drift leaves must be swept from gutters. Barnacles must be denied the tap. A crab that decides to explore a tank becomes a brief, respectful interruption followed by laughter and a new mesh screen tied more tightly. If a spring suddenly sulks, elders feel the rock with their palms, cool here, warmer there, and listen. Sometimes the tide brought silt that needs a small channeling. Sometimes a storm has shifted the cobbles and the water must be invited again with a new curb. If a tank's water tells a faint tale of mustiness, the house knows the remedy. Draw down to cooking and washing. Air the interior. Brush with lime. Give the dark back to the tank and the tank back to the dark. Scarcity teaches islands a choreography that looks like generosity from the outside. Guests are always offered a drink, but the cup is smaller when the dry months stretch thin. Laundry waits for the week after a rain, and dyes wait longer. The baker schedules syrup for mornings when the Cistern smiles. The school keeps a dipper by the door and writes a small rule on the chalkboard, 1 cup, 2 breaths, so that refills come with calm. Boats arriving from the mainland bring barrels as gifts more precious than coin. Boats departing carry the island's gratitude folded into fish and fruit and friendly rumours. Seawalls and gardens join the lesson. Overflow from tanks is not spilled. It is led, by a polite stone channel, to a row of basil pots or to a young coconut that will one day become its own shade. On breezy headlands, people build windbreaks from woven palm to protect their gutters. On low beaches, they raise a lip of stone against storm tongues so tanks do not drink what they did not invite. When a big storm is predicted, lids are tied, screens checked, taps close gently. Afterward, debris is cleared before anyone draws a celebratory cup. Gratitude follows hygiene in the island calendar. Not the other way around, islands also teach a tender physics that mainlanders forget. A freshwater lens is a buoyant cushion in a rock bowl. Pump too hard and the sea sneaks in underneath. Therefore, wells are shallow, draws are modest, and neighbours talk. A farmer whose irrigation pump pulls brackish for the first time hears about it at the jetty that evening. In kindness but with gravity. Ease up, someone says, or we all taste it next month. The rebuke has no badge or fine attached. It works because the island's map is also a chatty family. Tabletop geology visits kitchens. Jars are labelled by source, tank, spring, shared well. Tea from spring water tastes like a certain cove. Soup from tank water tastes like the roof's shade. Mango, tile, corrugated iron each leave the faintest, undefinable story behind. Children play blindfold games. Guess which water this is, name the wind that brought it. One gets it right by accident and is cheered as if he had solved a riddle older than the island's lighthouse at 18 night. Tanks and springs become instruments. A tap's soft chirr while the pot fills is a lullaby. The spring's slow thread beneath the moon tells fishermen when to sleep and when to lean on oars. Lovers walk the shore and take turns holding the jar under the rock spout. The sound is a secret that belongs to them and to everyone, like the way palm fronds talk when the trade wind thickens. Even the island dogs learn to drink where the overflow kisses sand, clean and sweet, and then to sit as if grateful for the physics they cannot name. Modernity brought plastic tanks and UV filters and pumps with timid solar panels. The nouns changed. The verbs stayed. Sweep, shade, screen, separate, share. The chain cup at a stone sabil became a bottle filler with a foot pedal at the pier. The ledger of who cleaned the spring last week became a text thread where someone posts a photo of cleared cobbles and a heart. Tourists arrive with thirst that forgets to be polite. Signs teach them gently, rinse your feet down shore. Lift the jar with 2 hands. Close the tap all the way. Most learn in a day. A few never do. The island forgives but does not forget and tightens its lids afterward. The lesson of islands is that sweetness survives beside salt when people choose to behave like stewards instead of consumers. A tank is not a hoard but a promise in the house. A spring is not a spectacle but a neighbour under the cliff. If you treat them as such, covering, sweeping, drawing with patience, and giving thanks without drama, the The sea will keep nodding yes from a few yards away. And the sky will keep remembering you with sudden, lovely rain. Cold teaches a different etiquette to water. In winter the bucket's lip bites a little, the rope stiffens like an old man's knee, and the first ladle may carry a lacework of ice that rings the basin like thin crystal. Communities that live with real winters learn to keep their wells not simply clean but alive, kept breathing under lids, protected from wind, coaxed into giving without cracking stone, clay, or patience. The season's lesson is not conquest. It is tenderness measured in small, habitual acts. The lid becomes a warm garment. In summer, it is a dust shield. In winter, it is a quilt. Households pad the underside with straw cord in cloth or with a circle of felt that sits like a halo on the coping. A folded rag lives between lid and stone so that wood does not freeze to rock. A little wooden wedge is kept nearby to loosen a stubborn seal without prying and chipping. Some villages add a simple wooden shelter, 4 posts and a roof, open at the sides, to break the wind's busy fingers. Snow drifts kindly around such shelters and becomes a second wall, a sound muffler that makes the well's voice softer and the square outside feel tucked in ropes, like hands, need warming. Before the morning draw, someone rubs the coil between palms, not theatrically, just enough to persuade the fibers to remember they are supple. If the rope must cross a roller, a thumb of oil touched in autumn prevents the squeal that winter cold makes shriller. In harsh places, people hang a spare loop indoors overnight. At dawn, they swap it onto the roller so the first bucket's weight runs across warmth rather than ice. Knots are treated more thoughtfully in winter. The quick hitch that works in July turns cruel in January when frozen. So winter knots favor loops that can be teased apart with a gloved finger, clay, and would change their tempers with cold. A clay jar that has lived on a warm shelf all night should not meet ice without mediation. So hands practice tempering. The first pour is small, a warmish trickle from a kettle, or simply a cup from the house that takes the bite out of the jar's lip before larger fills. Wooden buckets swell and shrink. The hoops are tapped more often in cold weather because contraction wakes tiny leaks. A bucket set down on snow picks up crystals that will later melt into grit in the well's hygiene. So a mat waits under the usual spot the way a doormat waits under a threshold. None of this feels fussy. It feels like breathing into your hands before lifting a child. Ice at the rim is both decoration and danger. The first clear pane looks pretty in lamplight, thin as sugar glass. The second pane is honesty. The surface is trying to seal. Villagers answer with a gentle ritual. A short stick, never metal, is used to tease open a drinking hatch in the ice, around no wider than a ladle. The rest is left intact as insulation. If the wellers work hard, the hatch grows quickly. If it is drawn lightly, the circle heals between uses, like a creature that prefers its coat on. Some places place floating lids, discs of wood or bundles of reeds, on the water so that the forming ice chooses them rather than the lining. A quick lift and the tender crust comes up like a hat, breath matters. In deep cold, a well's air can stratify, warmer below, biting at the mouth. Lifting the lid too long pours winter into the throat, shocking water and workers alike. So the draw becomes a choreography of timing. Lid off, bucket down, bucket up, lid on, pour aside. The person who pours often turns their back to the wind so that steam from warm kitchen water doesn't drift into the shaft and build frosting on the roller and rope. The rule that lids live on hinges or hooks, never tossed aside, becomes part of the body. Glove lifts, glove lowers, so the well spends more seconds in its coat than out. Paths too must be managed so that safety and cleanliness do not quarrel. Sand or cinders sprinkled for footing are kept far from the mouth. The line of shore steps arcs away from the lip and then returns. In snowy towns, 2 narrow trenches, jar width, are stamped and kept free so that carriers can place vessels without wobble. The bench where buckets rest is brushed before each use, not with a sweeping gesture that sprays grit, but with a downward press that compacts stray crystals and lets them melt into harmlessness later. Sometimes winters are hard enough to make people invent alternate well temperatures. In northern farms, a warm drawer is kept. A bucket-sized pot of smooth stone sits by the stove. Before a deep pull, The hottest stone is lifted with tongs and plunged into a small tub of well water to make a lukewarm pour that pre-tempers vessels and hands. The hot stone's hiss is a little drama that children adore and adults respect for the physics it saves them from. No sudden glass-breaking cold, no cracked earthenware. In places with shared bathhouses, the first hour after dawn may belong to them. Their gentle steam greets the hatch, melts what needs melting, and then yields the day to kitchens and animals. Water discipline shifts with temperature. Washing clothes at the well, always taboo at the rim, now moves farther away still. Suds freeze on stone and make sly traps. So winter laundries choose a sunny corner with a drain, away from traffic and the well shadow. Animal watering happens at a separated trough with its own lid or with a small heated brick placed under the pour spout. Beasts learn the angle that keeps their breath from thrusting the lip into a rime that will crack noses. Shared dippers go into a rinse kept indoors. Personal cups live in pockets, warm with body heat and less likely to collect the season's little germs. Snow itself becomes a resource, but gently handled. Fresh, clean falls are collected in baskets lined with cloth and melted in wide pans where heat is low and patient. The first melt is thrown away to rid the pot of any drifted dust. The middle is kept for washing and cooking. The last sludgy spoonful goes to the herb bed or the path's edges where it can freeze into harmlessness. People learn snow's vocabulary. Dry snow yields less, wet snow yields more but tastes like the sky's latest story. Smoke, sea, pine, depending on where you live. Children measure these with tongues and declare judgments with the seriousness of jurors. The soundscape of a winter well is special. A rope creaks differently in cold. The bucket slip, striking the coping, rings higher, like a bell a size too small. Boots thump with a damp thud. Breaths plume and are carried away as if the air were curious about your secrets. Inside houses, thawed water makes better broths than it did in autumn. Perhaps because patience has a taste, perhaps because winter sharpens gratitude. Tea near a window tastes like the view. White, quiet, and kind, crises are rehearsed quietly. If the hatch seals too thickly to tease open, a small copper kettle is used, not a hammer. If a rope freezes to the roller, nobody yanks. They pad the rope with a warm cloth and wait the short minute that saves 10 minutes of mending. If the surface goes stubborn after a week of mean air, the well is given a day of dignity. Draw to the garden or the animals. Scrub the coping. Let the water rest and stack its layers. Cover it more thoughtfully. Return at dusk with warmer hands and calmer breath. Wells in towns that use salt on streets face a different winter danger. Drifts at the curb glitter with a friendliness that is not friendly. As thaw comes and melt trickles, the watercourt's boundaries matter more than ever. Gutters are kept impeccable. Snow pushed from doorways is directed toward drains that lead away from the well's neighborhood. Children are taught the geography of not here. In older districts, the well may wear a skirt, planks fitted like a barrel around the coping's base, so that splashes from faraway wagons cannot hop the last foot into the throat. Protecting taste becomes a collective sport dying in the hardest latitudes, where a river sleeps under a floor of ice for months. Communities draw through ice rather than stone. Yet the manners rhyme. A hole is cut, a collar of straw or wood keeps edges from closing too quickly, and a lid, yes, even on a river, rests over the opening between pulls. The first water goes to tea for the cutters, the next to elders, then to animals, then to the long queue of ordinary chores. The cut is moved every few days so the river can heal and so the lane of footprints doesn't become a trap. Winter wells, whether in stone or ice, are not simply sources. They are stages for restraint and grace. When thaw finally arrives, the well smells different, less tight, more mineral. People notice without making a speech. Lids lose their padding by degrees rather than in a single triumphant day. Ropes hang easier. The bench brush is retired to its peg with a pat. Winter's carefulness is not discarded. It condenses into skill that will keep through summer. The habit of lids, the courtesy of separate places for separate tasks, the slow hand on the rope. The well remembers you remembered it, and it answers with steadiness. The lesson of winter wells is that warmth is not only a temperature. It is a behavior. Keep the wind out, the lid on, the rope supple, the bucket tempered, the path honest. Use patience as your heat source. Let small rituals do the work of large fires. Then water, even in the most crystalline month, stays alive, not a brittle jewel, but a fluent companion that meets your jar without fuss and carries a quiet promise into soup, tea, and sleep. A desert teaches patience by the mile, and caravans learn to carry their manners like shade. Between towns that shine like islands on a sea of sand. The only certain comfort is water that waits because someone promised it would. A caravan well. A rock-ringed pit, a palm-shadowed pithead. A low wall holding back the wind's gossip of grit. These places are less destinations than pauses where breath lengthens, ropes are checked. And creatures, human and otherwise, remember that travel is a sequence of sips as much as a chain of horizons. The best caravan wells are not accidents. They are agreements with geology. Some are scoured into the bed of an old wadi, where floods visit in temper and then forget. Others are drilled down to a stubborn lens of fresh water that floats above salt like kindness above pride. The making of a desert well is a craft of margins, walls lined with stone so the wind cannot shear them into a funnel. A coping high enough to keep hooves honest. A lid weighted against mischief, be it donkey nosing or dust storm. There is always a windbreak of some sort, an arc of dry stacked stones, a woven screen. A half ring of thorny brush, because the desert's first method of theft is movement from afar. A way station can look like nothing, just a darker stipple on the flat. Closer, you read the signs, the uprights of a shade frame, knotted with palm mat. The pale half-moons where camels knelt yesterday. The circle of tamped earth where bales were set down and their twine hissed as it loosened. Water declares itself less by sight than by behavior. Flies do not wander here. They congregate. Birds pass overhead in purposeful arcs. Even the smell speaks a quiet sentence. Mineral and shadow, a hint of leaf if someone has coaxed a few hardy tamarisks to live on the overflow. Desert wells divide space the way fountains divide time. Animals have a trough at one remove, filled by a channel that minds backflow as sternly as a grandmother minds tongues. People draw at the mouth, one by one, or two by two if the well has twin rollers. The order is unwritten but felt. Youngest handlers first so their beasts don't grow fretful. Elders whose joints complain. Strangers with less bargaining power. Finally, the patient. Suspicion withers under such choreography. It's difficult to quarrel when a soft rhythm governs every step. Rope taut, bucket down, bucket up, pour, step aside. The desert doesn't reward drama. It rewards cadence. Ropes in this country are their own ecology. Leather thongs meet fiber coils. Weights are tied so a bucket's mouth finds water without arguing. A spare length is kept under shade like a guest, because in dry air a rope forgets its suppleness quickly and must be reminded with oil and a hand's warmth. Buckets are wary of metal, too hot, too loud, and prefer coopered wood or thick clay with a lip that doesn't bruise against stone. A dipper exists for people, and it lives beneath a cloth like a secret. For beasts, the pour happens at a trough whose stone is worn into a shallow smile by a century of velvet muzzles. Night changes the way station into a classroom of stars. After the last animals have drunk and the last men have washed sand from their eyes, someone leans a staff against the coping and the constellations take attendance. The well's circle becomes a clock. We'll rise when that bright one rests just here. Stories tighten their belts and last longer in desert dark. Talk moves slowly as if respecting the reservoir beneath. A watch is set, not because of bandits alone, but because of the wind. An hour for each man to check the lid. The ropes, the embers of the cooking pit. To listen for the subtle hiss that says a dune is inching its way toward trouble. Maintenance at a caravan well is a craft shared between those who live nearby and those who travel through. The resident keeper, sometimes a family, sometimes a solitary man with a patient dog, keeps a book that is more in memory than in ink. Last scrubbing day. Last repair of the coping. Last time the windbreak was replatted. Passing caravans repay care with care. A new length of rope, a fresh pin for the hinge, a sack of dates, a story. Periodically, when trade slows and heat presses too hard, the well is given a day of dignity. Silt is lifted with baskets. Walls are inspected by lamplight. The trough drain is cleared so no little green foulness takes hold. The first draws after such work go to the keeper's garden, a strip of green improbable as a rumour. Where min huddles and a single fig tree insists on sweetness. There are rules here. And they have teeth, even if those teeth are hidden by smiles. No dyeing of cloth near the mouth. No washing of hides. No slushing as if volume had no meaning. Lids are replaced. Ashes from a cooking fire are carried downwind and tapped into a pit lined with stones, because ash pretends to be tame and then blows into throats. A child running is gently caught by the elbow and taught the rope's slow alphabet. If a stranger arrives without water because his judgment was thin, he drinks. But he also listens to a short lecture from the oldest throat. Not cruelty. Just a necessary rehearsal of desert arithmetic. Sometimes a well is treacherous in ways that are nobody's fault. A lens turns brackish. A layer shifts after distant rains and the water level sulks. Then courage is required. A decision to deepen, to widen, to collar the mouth with a stronger curb, to move the trough so overflow doesn't undercut the foundation. Deepening is the heaviest work a way station knows. Men descend with lamps. Timbers brace. Shovels speak the slow language of inch and hour. When the first bucket comes up with a cooler smell, a hush gathers on the lip. It is like hearing breath return to someone you feared had gone too quiet. Caravans plan their entire patience around the chain of such wells. Distances are measured not in miles but in sips per beast and the number of breaths a man can keep steady under sun. A merchant revises his load because one more bolt of cloth means one less skin of water. A captain chooses night marches because the sand keeps shape better and the stars argue less than a day's mirage. If a well fails, a map is rewritten by necessity. Rumours run like thin streams, and the next caravan carries more and gives less. If a well thrives, trade fattens. A new screen is added. Someone raises a tiny minaret that is mostly a sundial and a promise. Winds teach architecture here. The windward side of the mouth is armoured. Stones stacked with their long faces turned like shields. Gaps filled so eddies do not carve mischief. The lee gets a small cord of hard-packed earth where the kneeling and the lifting happen. A pergola made of poles and laced mats migrates with the seasoned sun, shading the bench where a slate sits. On that slate someone chalks the day's cautions. Low flow, patient. Or drink first for animals with loads. Or good evening for washing. Writing blows away. The habit stays. Kindness travels with these caravans because unkindness withers too quickly to reproduce. A man with extra shade shares it because shade cannot be hoarded without souring the heart that tries. A woman with an extra jar lends it because a jar unused is a brittle thing. Children trade dates for stories about cities they cannot imagine. The way light looks on a harbour, the size of a river that never goes to sleep. Memory collects. The well where a poet composed or recited a thrum of lines while waiting his turn. The well where a storm came in sideways and people laughed with grit on their teeth. The well where a lost camel returned by itself and was greeted like a prodigal uncle. Not all desert water stands. In some places, a shallow browse of roots and grasses hides a seep, too fragile for buckets, perfect for reeds and for a trickle guided into a lined hollow. A good way station learns to spare such seeps. The animals are led elsewhere, and a small fence made of twigs declares a sanctuary where small lives drink. Hunters and herders lean elbows on that fence and feel a restraint that makes them larger, not smaller. The desert repays such restraint not with abundance but with continuity, which is the more honest gift. Modern roads draw lines across these old constellations of wells. Petrol replaces dates as the most worrisome commodity. Tires replace hooves. Speed replaces cadence. Still, the old way stations do not vanish. They become laybys, memorials, or working stops for people who prefer range to schedule. A plastic tank stands where a stone trough stood. A tap replaces a rope. A solar panel keeps a pump breathing. The manners, when they survive, look familiar. A sign that says fill your can, close the lid. A shaded bench. A chalkboard with warnings. A little garden astonishing in its insistence. New caravans, convoys, collect the same respect. Emergencies teach it all over again. The lesson of caravan wells is spare and noble. When the world is mostly distance, a circle of water is civilization enough. Keep the wind out, the lid on, the trough separate, the rope clean. Pay back care with care. Leave a place better stocked with order than you found it. Measure your journey not by how hard you pushed, but by how steadily you arrived. And in the long afternoons when heat sits like a thought you cannot finish, remember that the desert's greatest praise is reserved for the unremarkable, a well that never surprises, a shade that never fails, a cup that is always quietly there. If a private well is a family's heartbeat and a cistern is a house's quiet pantry, then a public fountain is a city's open hand. You can hear it before you see it, a courteous thread of falling water that smooths the edges off noise. Markets shout more softly near a fountain. Hooves trot with better manners. The air feels cleaned, as if the sound itself were rinsing dust from thought. A good city learns to put these small mercies where the day most needs them, at crossroads, beside mosques and churches, under the canopy of plane trees. Within reach of the tired, ancient towns understood that public water is both infrastructure and invitation. In Roman quarters, fountains, Lacus and Castella, received aqueduct water, then shared it outward, first to a basin for cups, next to troughs for animals, and finally into runnels that washed streets and fed gardens. Their lips were worn to silk by centuries of cups, their stone scoops polished by hands that came from everywhere. The water was not free to waste. It was free to use together. Behind the gracious facade stood the quiet machinery of regulation, caretakers who cleared strainers of leaf debris, repaired spouts, and counted the hours of flow. The basin's rim taught a wordless lesson. If everyone leaned gently, no one pushed. If everyone poured carefully, no one spilled. Farther east and south, another tradition braided charity into architecture, the sabil. Built as acts of devotion and civic pride, sabils offered drinking water to any passerby, an answer to heat that carried the signature of a benefactor and the labor of a guild of keepers. Some had grills of fine bronze and stonework like lace, filigree shadows playing on the splash of a thin sheet of water. In Ottoman streets, a sabil might share a wall with a cut tab, a small school upstairs where letters and numbers rode the coolness rising from below. Children learned to write while the city learned to be gentle, a cup offered across a counter to a courier with a dusty beard. A widow with a clay jar, a child laughing at the cold, sabils worked on simple principles that felt like ceremony. A shaded reservoir, fed by a conduit, a cistern, or the tail of an aqueduct, sat behind or beneath the facade. The water passed through settling boxes and fine mesh to keep visible life out, then met the public through a spout or a slot shape to send a smooth veil into a waiting basin. Dippers were kept on chains not as suspicion but as convenience. The chain declared, "You do not need to own a cup to be welcome." Caretakers swept at dawn, refilled and strained at noon, and sat on a stool by lamplight at dusk watching the neighborhood wash its hurry away with a sip. Their wages might come from a charitable trust, waqf, that also kept lamps lit and stone joints renewed. In their ledger, the currency was not gallons but hours of relief. Public water made maps of kindness. A traveller planned his route by fountains the way a sailor planned by stars. Stallholders carted their goods to corners with an easy reach of a ladle. A poorhouse without a jar stand could still keep soup honest, because a street with a sabil kept everyone's patience from boiling. Even quarrels cooled there. People said, "Speak to me after you drink," and often the drink endowed both sides with the few extra breaths needed to arrive at sense. Fountains raised a public standard for taste. If the cup at the corner was sweet and mineral cool, then anything beneath that would shame a kitchen into better behavior. Design mattered because design carried manners. The spout was set low enough for a child to reach and high enough to spare the back of a bent elder. The apron stone before the basin sloped to a narrow drain so that spilt water left tidily for a herb patch. Where animals drank, a separate trough stood at a polite distance, or a clever ledge delivered overflow to a lower basin, which the donkey understood as his. The writing on the stone, if any, was modest and legible, a verse about compassion, an invocation to remember the thirsty, a date and a name folded quietly into the whole. Ornament met utility in an accord like a well-tuned instrument. Beautiful enough to attract care, simple enough to invite mending, cleaning was a choreography set to the city's tempo. The basin was scrubbed with a brush that never touched shoes. The lip of the spout was wiped as lovingly as a tea glass. Lids were tested on reservoirs. Vents were opened and closed to keep air moving but insects discouraged. In hot months, caretakers learned to shade their own bodies as they shaded the fountain, moving their stool with the sun's crawl. At night, a small shutter might be drawn over the grill, not to deny thirst but to give the fountain its sleep. So the morning could begin with a clear first pour and a gentle sound. There were rules, and they were gentle but firm. No washing of clothes at the drinking basin. No rinsing of meat or vegetables. No buckets plunged, only cups filled. Children were welcome to laugh but not to splash. Animals were welcomed elsewhere. When a drought drew the city thin, the fountain did not become a battlefield. It became a schedule. Hours were posted by habit, early for workers with tools on their shoulders, late morning for elders, afternoon for families, evening for those returning from fields and ferries. The keeper became a conductor, raising and lowering an invisible baton to keep the day's water a melody rather than a struggle. Stories accreted like limescale and were cleaned only when they harmed. A tale of a prince who disguised himself to pour water here at midnight. A rumor that someone recovered from fever after a sip offered by a stranger. Whether or not such things occurred, they planted a moral that stuck. Water given freely can heal things law cannot. People left small alms in a niche, not a purchase price, just gratitude. In some districts, a baker carried the fountain's overflow to knead dough on summer mornings when well slept. In return, he set aside a loaf for the keeper. Reciprocity went around like a bucket at a rope circle. Everyone took a turn, and nobody needed to be heroic. Fountains taught cities to breathe. Their sound masked the argument between wheel and cobble. Their cool made a shade seem deeper than it was. In the hour before sleep, when lamps came on and the heat finally loosened its fingers, couples paused for a cup and a word. Couriers paused for a cup and no word at all. Under their grills, a small ecology survived, moss where spray reached, a gleam where hands rubbed brass bright. Sometimes, if a keeper was indulgent, a single goldfish in a protected niche, not as spectacle but as a sentinel for health, if the fish was lively. The city smiled when empires shifted and pipes replaced conduits. Public water changed costumes but kept old virtues. A modern drinking fountain with a push button and a stainless lip is still a sabil that forgot its lace and learned new hygiene. The chain became a bubbler. The ledger of arms became a maintenance budget. The lamp became a service call. Where cities are wise, they still place fountains at bus depots and markets and parks, and they protect them from turning into ashtrays and litter bins. Where cities forget, summers remind them, throats dry, tempers fray, and a small column of water can feel like policy done right. Memory clings to stone even when names fade. You can touch a groove worn on a marble lip and know that tens of thousands of mouths found comfort here. You can stand at a corner where a sibyl once murmured and still swear the air holds a cooler note in late afternoon. Some old basins remain without water, kept as sculpture. Yet even then they teach. The niche, the shade, the graceful height of a spout. These are ergonomic kindnesses that courts and codes take far longer to invent. Architects sketch them into new public buildings. A shaded recess for a bottle filler, a drain that waters a planter. A bench near enough for rest but far enough to keep the queue free. The lesson of public fountains and sabils is not complicated. Make a place where a stranger can drink without debt. Make it beautiful enough that people feel proud to keep it clean. Give it rules that are gentle and clear. Let it sing softly into the day so that tempers cool and conversations lengthen. Then a city becomes not just passable in summer but generous. An urban wellspring where cups are small, refills are welcome, and thirst is answered by grace that belongs to everyone and to no one in particular. Some places answer thirst not with a circle but with a descent. A Stepwell, Bowley, Vorv, Varv, Bordy, the names change softly across tongues, is a water temple disguised as an everyday staircase. From the dusty horizon, You might miss it entirely. Only a parapet and a small pavilion hint that anything waits below. But as you step inside, the world drops away in measured flights, stone treads turning sunlight into ribbons, heat into hush, and dry air into the cool breath that rises from shadowed water. A stepwell begins with slope in reverse. Instead of persuading water to walk to you, you agree to walk down to meet it. Builders choose a site with a winning combination of geology and patience, an aquifer within friendly reach, strata that will accept carving, and a community willing to tend a structure that is both utility and ornament. Plans are geometry married to weather. Shafts and galleries are aligned to catch breezes. Courtyards and walls are arranged to invite shade deeper and deeper as the day lifts. Platforms appear like pauses in a conversation, places to rest a jar or a story. Descending, you feel the architecture tuning the day. At the top, sun presses on your shoulders. Voices sound ordinary. A few flights down, relief arrives in the skin before the mind names it. The stone is cooler to the hand. Your breath lengthens. Niches in the walls hold lamps, clay cups, or offerings. Balconies lean over empty ere the way a mother leans to check a sleeping child. Carvings bloom from pillars, floral knots, small guardians, patterns that make patient sense when you run your fingers along them as you pass. By the time you reach the water's lip, the square outside has become a rumor and the pool below you a certainty, dark and calm. Like an eye that has decided to trust you, Stepwells are scholarship in water levels. In generous years, the pool rises until the lower flights drown, and swimmers laugh in the echoing green. In lean years, stairs keep going, taking you to the last tender inch of reachable water. Markings carved into cornerstones become a calendar that elides the need for numbers. A lotus medallion scratched at a certain tread means the monsoon was kind that year. A plain groove a few steps below reminds how far people once had to walk to feed their jars. Children learn to count seasons by counting flights. Elders remember the feel of the fourth platform shade at noon in different decades. And by that memory they estimate what to plant and when to ask the sky politely again. Because Stepwells invited people to linger, they learn the manners of small cities. Vendors set up under arches with powdered sweets, brass polish, thread. A washer kneels at a rinsing stone where a shallow channel carries away suds to a herb bed rather than back to the pool. A scholar unrolls a palm leaf manuscript in a corner of soft light and teaches a child to trace letters that look like river weeds. Travelers sleep on ledges carved as if the stone itself wanted to make a bed. A shrine sits in a quiet alcove halfway down, nothing grand, just a sentinel to remind you that gratitude is part of drinking. Maintenance hides in this grace the way fruit hides inside blossoms. Silt and leaves are lifted by baskets at the end of the dry season, when a day's work makes the next month's water clearer. Lime plaster is touched where it thins, but much of the carving is left uncoated, letting stone breathe. Where steps chip, masons patch with shaped blocks that respect the old angle. Wooden rails are avoided. Wood temps rot, so stone carries both ornament and function. The water's edge is kept clean by a simple rule. Jars enter only on a platform with a low curb. Bare feet rinse on a landing with its own drain. None of this feels like policing. It feels like choreography that has learned to hum along with thirst. Stories live here the way swallows live under a bridge. Lovers meet on the third platform and pretend to be strangers as they pass. A traveling singer finds the acoustics generous and gives a free concert that becomes cuisine. Everyone talks about it with flavors for weeks after. Old-timers tell how a king's daughter once dropped a ring and how the ripple revealed the truth of some long-ago injustice. Whether it happened is less important than that it is retold softly, and that it makes everyone look into the water as if it might choose to answer again. Superstitions walk lightly. Don't count your steps aloud. Save breath for respect. Don't shout when you first see the pool. Let the cool rise first, then speak to the lip. A small pavilion often stands with pillars that seem to be holding the sky and, by implication, holding luck. Beneath it, the simplest devices work: rope and pulley, bucket and balance. The staircase does not abolish lifting. It makes lifting gentler and safer. A short haul replaces a long one. A steady footing replaces the teeter at the well's mouth. Women sit together on a landing, trading recipes to the rhythm of the crank. A traveller fills a goatskin without needing a second hand to steady his body. The machines of thirst are the same as anywhere else, but the building has shown them a kindness. Stepwells also became ledgers of generosity. Many were gifts, by queens and widows, by merchants returning from luckier seasons, by guilds that wanted to bind themselves to a place beyond contracts and seals. An inscription near the entrance might speak in the modest arithmetic of charity. 1,000 pitchers spared the road in the hot month. 100 brides blessed here. Travellers warded across 20 rains. Even when names fade, the generosity remains legible in the practical intelligence of the plan. You can tell a miserly stepwell by its narrow throat and stingy platforms. You can spot a generous one by how easily your arms find room to turn a jar. Heat thinks differently near a stepwell. In the late afternoon, when streets blanch and shutters complain, boys learn to sit on the stone of the higher landings where the air is a little cooler than ordinary. Women bring grain to winnow where the breeze behaves. Chaff lifts and drifts away like tiny moths. A scribe moves his worktable 3 treads down when ink grows sulky, and his letters sharpen with the temperature's patience. Night arrives from the bottom up. The first star you see is in the water, then in the gap of sky above, and the two seem like a secret you share with the place. In some regions, stepwells link arms with surface tanks and gardens. Overflow feeds a lined square where lotus pads steady dragonflies. The tank feeds a grove of neem and pomegranate. The grove feeds the town with shade and fruit. And when the year tilts toward lean, the stepwell returns the favor by offering an extra flight of water to stretch the grove's roots. Everything becomes a weave: stairs, roots, jars, shade, patience. A village that tends such a weave doesn't speak of independence. It speaks of interlocking chores that feel like kindness, because they as ages pass, the maintenance of stepwells becomes both more important and more fragile. Silt would prefer to win. Vines would love to turn carvings back into forest. City trash would rather pretend the stairs are a ready-made pit. Communities answer with brooms, with seasonal cleaning parties that feel half like festivals and half like debt repayment. Children are sent with small baskets and come home proud. The old recite the names of the masons who raised the pillars. The young add their own names quietly in dust, which is erased honourably at sunset. If a stepwell can survive indifference for a few years, it can survive centuries with care. Modern water systems look away from stairs and toward pipes and pumps. Yet stepwells still tutor cities that wish to be wise. They show how to make a public utility into a public space, how to cool air without machinery, how to make maintenance a community ritual rather than a hidden bill. Architects borrow their lessons: light from above, shade from the sides, pockets for rest, a modest reveal of sky, and reweave them into libraries and schools. Engineers remember that depth can be a friend when heat is not. And anyone can remember that water, treated with ceremony, treats people with calm. In the end, a stepwell is a staircase into mutual patience. Your feet learn humility going down. Your hands learn gratitude coming up. Your eyes learn to see coolness as something architecture can shape, not just weather can grant. The pool at the bottom is not large. It doesn't need to be. It is the center of a spiral of attention: stone, shade, breeze, habit, and everything that rises from it carries a little of that cool upward into the day. Communities do not keep water by muscle alone. They keep it by manners. A good well is less a hole in the ground than a quiet covenant, protected by small rules that add up to health. Those rules rarely wear uniforms. They wear habits: brushes by the coping stone, lids that always find their place, a certain distance measured without measuring tapes between what should never meet: the well and the waste, the bucket and the dust, haste and the rope. If you stay by a well long enough, you can watch how a town's conscience collects around it the way dew collects around a cool jar at dawn. Distance is the first guardian. In the old quarters of many towns, you can trace water's safety in the way streets slope. Latrines drift downhill, tanneries sit in the wind's lee, middens grow on the far side of a lane whose camber is not accidental. Mothers teach children how to read the paving. Here the stones tilt toward the herb bed, they're toward the gutter. This corner drains away from the well's shadow, that one would not be a good place to peel onions. When people rebuild after a flood or a bad season, the well becomes the center of a quiet starburst of prudence, kitchens upwind. Animals watered at a trough with its own runoff where splashes cannot wander back. Dye pots kept beneath a roofing tile that scolds any hurried pour by making it echo, lids are the second guardian, and they speak softly but constantly. A well without a lid is an invitation to insects, to leaves, to gossiping wind. The lid is lifted as if it sleeps and should not be startled. A folded cloth waits to receive it so the rim is not chipped. The lid returns as a promise that what is below remains untroubled. Children love to lift lids. Adults teach them to replace them. The small choreography of up, turn, set, that becomes a muscle memory stronger than any lock. In summer dust, the lid is a shield. In winter, it is a roof that keeps thin ice from descending into the throat and startling a bucket into a crack. Cover your water is one of the oldest sentences, and it has never stopped being wise. Cleanliness is the third guardian, and it manifests in small, satisfying tasks. A brush with soft bristles lives in the shade. A cloth lives in a lidded jar. The coping stone is wiped each morning, not because it looks dirty, but because it will look clean all day if it is visited early. The roller is dusted before it is oiled, because grit is a miser that steals from ropes one scratch at a time. The dipper is rinsed both before and after use, and that double attention, anticipation and gratitude, slowly makes a culture. The bucket sits on a mat rather than on bare ground. The mat sits on a platform rather than on damp soil. The platform is swept. Each of these details could be neglected once without disaster, but disaster feeds on the habit of neglect. So people keep a string of small courtesies instead. Taboos arrive where speech loses its patience and decides to take a shortcut into the heart. No washing of clothes at the rim, says a sign not on wood but on everyone's face. No rinsing of meat knives. No wetting of sandals. No spitting to bless. These no's are not angry. They are careful. Some towns appoint a well warden, an elder with a lamp in the evening and a broom in the morning, whose authority looks like good posture and who carries the keys for nothing but the storage of brushes. Other places distribute guardianship. Every family takes a day. And you can tell whose day it is by the extra bucket set upside down like a little crown on the bench as a signal. We are watching with love today because fear travels faster than facts. Wells gather stories the way trees gather ribbons. Whispered tales of poisoners sometimes circle in hard times. A stranger seen too near the rim, a fever that moved from house to house as if it had legs. The moral core beneath the myth is not completely foolish. Water does carry illness, and in crowded seasons disease can ride the dipper. Communities answer two ways at once, by tightening the practical rules and by weaving a gentle superstition that keeps the heart attentive. Charms are tied to the lid, a blue bead, a scrap of copper engraved with a verse, a small bell that complains if the lid is lifted in an odd hour. Lanterns are left lit one night a month, and the well's shadow becomes a faint candle pull in the square as if to say, "We see you, and we see each other." Real safeguards hide in the unromantic acts behind the charms. Separate dippers for separate tasks, one for drinking, one for washing, one for the animals. A sign, the simplest carving, reminds everyone which is which. The drinking dipper is short, so it cannot reach too far down and muddy the best of the water. The washing dipper is long, so it can serve basins without splashing back. In plague years or seasons of cough, the village returns to old, slow rituals. The dipper for personal use is boiled at sunset and hung where the smoke keeps flies hesitant. Anyone fevered drinks from a separate jar. The well's lip is swept with strong tea or vinegar, the scent becoming a declaration that care is underway. Visitors are welcome to the bench, not to the throat. The language of civility rearranges itself for a while and then relaxes again when the season withdraws. Boundary is another guardian. The well occupies a space larger than its stones. Invisible lines are understood. No animals beyond this mark. No market stall within that line. No sleeping bundles left on the bench at night to gather dew and then drip back. In bigger towns, A low rail or a stone chain separates the well from a square's rummage. It is not ornament as much as distilled advice. Children throw a leg over it and are told, kindly but firmly, to swing back. The rail says what everyone knows. This place is both public and precise. Time itself guards water when people allow it. Draw at dawn and dusk. Let noon be a time of rest for the rope. Let the first minutes after dust storm belong to sweeping and settling rather than to dipping. If the water has been troubled, if someone has leaned too far with a muddy sleeve, if a frog has found a short adventure, then give the well a day of dignity. Pump or lift for the garden, scrub what needs scrubbing, let the silt fall to its corner. Patience is a purifier older than filters that in places where enemies were once a worry. Wells invented disguises. Cistern mouths hid under tiles or beneath benches. Wellheads sat under little porches that looked like shrines or like storage sheds. A lid might be painted to seem unremarkable, or the true mouth might be offset from the obvious coping by a clever channel, so that a vandal lugging a heavy jar of dye would find only stone upon stone. Stories of such protective tricks outlast the enemies who inspired them. Even in peaceful centuries, the town keeps its little deceit because it is a lesson in not tempting trouble. Water and festivals seem like opposites. One is daily duty. The other, rare permission, but the two meet at the rim with mutual respect. A feast day might include a blessing at the well, but the priest or elder pours his libation on the coping rather than inside, the scent rising but the liquid refusing to dilute anyone's cup. On wedding days, a bride may lift the lid and listen for an echo, but she does not dip. That honor is saved for the first week of quiet domestic life when joy has had time to learn the word routine. Children are told that to wish at a well is to wish for patience. Any coin dropped goes not into the water but into a small wooden box whose lid is carved with a wave and a rope. The box pays for oil, for brushes, for the occasional new hoop for a faithful bucket. Because wells teach community, they also teach forgiveness. The rules feel stern until you watch an old woman spill a little as she laughs and see how gently a neighbor's cloth appears, blotting rather than scolding. The cloth is wrung away from the rim, the drip led into time. The event becomes an example that stories return to afterward. Remember the day she laughed so hard. People say, smiling. And beneath the joke lies the reminder that kindness is a kind of cleanliness too, keeping bitterness from seeping into shared water. Even the shadows help to guard. At certain hours, the well shade lines up with a particular groove in the cobbles, set there long ago by a careful hand, showing the path of tidy feet and jar stands. In the long afternoons of summer, the shadow reaches the market's edge, and vendors step their mats back 2 finger widths so dust raised by shoes has room to fall before it can cross the invisible border. You can tell a seasoned vendor from a restless one by whether her mat obeys the shadow. When wells and cisterns share a town, the manners braid. The first flush jar by the roof becomes a miniature of the big taboos below. Catch the dirty beginning, keep the clean middle, spare the sour end. At the well, people repeat the same sequence with arms and buckets instead of pipes and baffles. The logic is shared. What begins a flow is not always what you keep. What ends it is not always worth the stir. The center is what you share. That sentence becomes both plumbing and philosophy. The modern world sometimes thinks it has outgrown guardians and taboos, but the appliances still obey them in quieter forms. The kitchen's filtered tap has a lid of sorts, a valve shut after each use. The rain barrel has a screen. The campground pump has a little circle of gravel around its foot so mud does not leap into the first pour. The sign that says "No washing dishes here" at the lakeshore is the descendant of a grandmother's raised eyebrow at the village well. The story has new nouns but the same verbs: cover, sweep, separate, wait, thank. In hot, dry lands where the sun turns distance into a shimmer and hills into mirages, people learn to move water the way shepherds move flocks, quietly, at a measured pace, and mostly by keeping it out of sight. A Qanat is not a canal. It is a whisper beneath your feet, a gently sloped tunnel that persuades groundwater to stroll toward town without boiling under daylight. At its beginning stands a mother well, deep and patient, a vertical promise drilled into the hillside where the aquifer breathes. From that dark throat, A horizontal gallery sets off with a discipline that could be mistaken for stubbornness but is really mercy. Too steep and the water rushes and erodes. Too shallow and it sulks. The right incline is the art, just enough for a travelling mirror. The motherwell is named like a person because it mothers a lineage of water. Its shaft might descend as far as courage allows, 50, 100, more human heights, walled where the soil crumbles, ringed where the rock relents. A crew, roped and calm, listens for the language of strata, gravel that rattles, clay that sighs, stone that rings like a bell when struck and then takes a notch if you sweet-talk it long enough. Lamps burn a steady yellow. Air is cooler than the world above, and the smell is of mineral, not of rot. When the motherwell reaches the aquifer's shoulder and a pool gathers, the team pauses the way bakers pause when dough first sighs under their palms. They test, not with haste but with patience, because a motherwell that draws too greedily can unteach the hillside how to hold itself. From the motherwell's foot, the Qanat begins its slow sentence. The gallery is just large enough for a person to work, one set of shoulders wide, and kneeling height, sometimes less. Tools echo softly. Line-of-sight lamps show a faint, receding constellation. Above the tunnel, a dotted line of vertical shafts is sunk to daylight at regular intervals. Maintenance wells, breathing wells, lantern wells. From a distance, a finished Qanat looks like a ruler laid across desert, each dot a little crater ringed with spoil. Up close, the dots are lifelines. Air exchanges here. Spoil baskets travel here. Men are hauled up blinking into noon and set down again into the long cool paragraph. Slope is everything. A string and weight, plumb and level, serve as scripture. The master digger protects the gradient like a midwife protects a rhythm. A finger-width fall in so many cubits, no more, no less. If a layer threatens to collapse, the gallery is dressed with stone or fired brick, mortared just enough to keep the curve. The floor is sometimes paved where grit likes to wake. Where the earth grows stingy, the gallery can become an undersong carved through rock, its ceiling arched to remember forces older than any town. A Qanat is conservative in the best sense. It aims not to impress, but to endure. When the tunnel finally reaches the foot of the slope near a settlement, it greets the sun in a modest outfall, the daylight mouth. Here a headwall stands, a small gate can stop or share, and a settling basin receives the first, most excited Porso sand can sit and patience resume. From there, channels walk the water into measure, a garden share, a public fountain's cup, a bathhouse ladle, a cattle trough at a respectful distance, and a remainder, if mercy is abundant, led to a planted fringe beyond the wall, where trees make a windbreak and shade untangles. Heat, Qanats teach us special civility because their bounty is continuous but not infinite. Flow is a sentence that should not be interrupted by greed. Water courts divide the day into shares, hours for upper orchards, hours for lower fields, hours for the temple's wash, hours for the poor whose jars are light. A small clepsydra or a sun's shadow judges fairness. Wooden gates lifted and lowered with simple pegs tick off the schedule like slow metronomes. Disputes are handled in the language of slope and volume. A canal can be dammed in anger, but a Qanat forgives only careful hands. People learn restraint. You cannot hurry underground water, only cooperate with it. Maintenance is ritual disguised as labor. At dawn, crews descend along the dotted spine of shafts, each person adopting a section the way a shepherd adopts a stretch of hillside. Silt is scooped and hauled in baskets, handed up like bread. Where the ceiling weeps and makes stalactites, the drips are coaxed into channels. Lime is knocked back before it grows teeth. If a fox or an unlucky goat finds a shaft and tumbles, the story is told with a sigh and the work pauses for reverent removal. The water is let pass for fields for a day, then the motherwell is greeted again with a broom and a soft brush. Every gesture is small and thorough, because neglect is the only predator that a Qanat really dreads. Villagers read their futures in the Qanat's manners. In generous years, the outfall wears a silver mustache and the troughs chatter. Children splash with feet but not with hands, and someone laughs before reminding them that joy must be tidy. In lean years, the flow thins to a quiet thread and the calendar tightens its belt. A baker adjusts his schedule. boiling syrup when a watercourt smiles in his direction. A dyer saves indigo for later and lets the vat snap. A mason volunteers to reline a troubled bend as his tax. The Qanat lives like a heartbeat, slower during drought, quickening after storms feed the aquifer's distant shoulder. The desert's marching edge, Qanats braid with caravan wells. Way stations appear where the dotted shaft line grazes a route. A low wall keeps wind from gossiping sand into the mouth. A palm or tamarisk is planted where the outfall can spare it. Shade says to travellers, "Our water walks. Sit while it arrives." Caravans learn to time their rest with the Qanat's patience. They draw at evening when the air is cooler and the rope gentler. They leave gifts, sacks of dates, a new length of rope, a story, or they leave nothing but courtesy and tidiness, which is a gift of equal value in a place that prefers order. Cities adopt Qanats as arteries. In some old quarters, every lane climbs or falls unnoticed toward a fountain whose cup is always brimmed by an unseen gallery below. Houses wear courtyards not only for light but for meeting the water halfway, a jar stand near a shaded corner. A stone channel no wider than a hand that guides rinses to a lemon tree. A small basin that listens to the night with a round ear and offers a ladle at dawn. The poorest house can be rich in coolness because a Qanat shares by design what a well rations by effort. There are taboos here, too, tuned to this particular technology. Do not dig a latrine near the dotted line. Do not pound posts where the roof of the gallery runs like a hidden street. Do not shout into a shaft. The echo belongs to the men working below. Charms hang at shaft mouths, not because a spirit guards water, but because people do. A blue bead, a foxtail, a strip of copper with a verse, all shorthand for remember your manners. Someone's life is under you. When people move away or forget, Qanats do not rage. They fade. The dotted line collapses into a line of scars. The mother well warms. The outfall falls silent and fills with dust. Yet even then, the memory of the slope remains, and a future town can wake it with a broom, a plumb line, a brave crew, and a new patience. Old galleries have been rescued like lost roads, and when water walks again. Elders cry in the quiet way that dry countries cry. No drama. Only the relief of seeing an old sentence finish its clause. Modern pipes hum loudly. Pumps shove water uphill with motors, and meters spin like busy beetles. But where people still live with thin margins and honest heat, the Qanat's temperament survives. Engineers bring laser levels and hard hats, and still the foreman pads through dust with a mason's old string and weight, muttering the numbers of slope like a lullaby. The motherwell gets a concrete collar, perhaps, and a steel ladder, but the lamp's calm flame and the worker's patient breath feel timeless. Continuous, modest, repairable, these are virtues that never age. The lesson of Qanats is a kind of shyness that becomes strength. Hide water from the sun so it stays calm. Guide it gently so it does not injure itself or you. Share it by schedule rather than by argument. Keep the dotted line tidy, the motherwell respected, the outfall modest, the gradient right. If you must have a miracle, make it method. Then a city can sip for centuries from a river that never once raises its voice. Water is heavy in every century, and so the old world answered with patience first and leverage second. Before the ingenious machines, there was rhythm, a rope pulled on the beat of breath, a bucket lifted with the tide of a song. If you stood beside a well through a full day, you could hear technique maturing into music, small corrections becoming habits, habits becoming custom. Custom becoming the village's quiet choreography for getting weight to rise without breaking either a vessel or a back. The rope teaches the earliest lesson. Fibre remembers mistreatment, and people who live by water don't forget that. Ropes are kept out of grit the way a baker keeps flour off a wet floor, because one careless drag across sand writes a future of tiny cuts and sudden failure. A good rope is a story of materials tuned to purpose. Palm fibre and date fibre, hemp and flax, twisted with enough lay to be supple but not so much that the strands bite into one another. Coils are hung in shade, not piled where a midday sun can bake stiffness into them. When the day is done, someone wipes the length with a rag to remove mineral dust, the way a shepherd wipes the salt from leather. A few thumbfuls of oil meet the wooden roller's axle where the rope turns across it. Because a high note, squeak against squeak, wastes strength and wears time into splinters. The bucket answers the rope like a phrase answers a question. The older ones are clay, their bellies rounded for slosh forgiveness, their lips thickened to survive the kiss of the well's throat. Later come wooden buckets, staves hugged by hoops, their seams swelling shut after morning soaking. The bales are hung from lugs that keep knuckles out of harm's way when a pour begins. A small wedge can be tapped to renew the hoop's grip after a long day of lifts, and there's a kind of satisfaction in the muted ring when wood and iron decide to agree again. In some places, leather buckets live beside their rigid cousins, lighter, kinder to the well's lining, quick to pour a soft ribbon rather than a sudden gulp. None of these tools boast. They are made to be repaired, and repair is treated as tenderness. Once the grammar of rope and bucket is learned, the village adds adjectives of leverage. The simplest and most elegant is a beam with a counterweight, the shaduf in many tongues, a seesaw tamed to thirst. A pole pivots atop a post. A stone or clay weight hangs from the long end. The short end lowers an empty vessel and rises with a full one, trading distance for ease. The person at the pole learns to step and lean rather than strain, heavier work in the feet than in the face, and a second person waits at the receiving trough to guide the pour. Used in fields, the beam can lift a furrow's worth of water into a channel, and a day of steady pairs moves an astonishing amount without bruising a shoulder. The sound of shadufs in a green valley is a series of soft thumps and settling. Sighs, weight meeting rest and then moving again with the patience of a pendulum where the village deepens. Or the field grows ambitious. The shaduf's lyric becomes a chorus of wheels. A sakia or Persian wheel, names multiply as rivers do, turns paddles or pots around an axle, sipping from the low and delivering to the high with teeth and rhythm. Clay jars or wooden cups are laced to a looped rope. Each dips below, scoops, rises, tips, and returns. Once set to motion, by a human at a crank, by a donkey leaning into a blindfolded circle, by a river's own muscle, the chain forgets to be dramatic. It simply presents water at the top, steady as a heartbeat. A good wheel is tuned the way a lute is tuned. Cups must be large enough to matter, small enough not to complain as they pass the throat. The axle must be true. The trough must receive the pour without indignity. The blindfold on the animal is not just kindness. It is engineering, monotony without dizziness, work without panic. Ropes and wheels teach villagers to think in preventive circles rather than heroic lines. Lubrication is a morning ritual. Inspection is an afternoon one. Shafts are checked where they vanish into a bearing housing. If the wood darkens there, a whisper from the oiler's jar becomes an answer. A tooth chip is caught early and recarved by a patient hand at dusk. The seam where a jar binds to a rope is renewed with fresh lashings. Old knots are untied and retied so that rut doesn't hide. The well's top, its coping and roller and beam, becomes a little workshop of anticipations. No one praises it because praise would be as strange as applauding breathing. It is the village's pulse, and everyone knows where it is. The body becomes part of the machine. Lift with legs, never with back, say elders who never once said ergonomics. A stance is taught by example, not rule. Feet set with a little space, one forward for the pull, one behind for the return. Hands change places on the rope during the hoist, like a climber reading a cliff. One hand gathers, the other holds, and then they trade. Calluses are not badges. They are maps. A new person's hands are soft and uncertain. By harvest season, those same hands speak a fluent, quiet language of pressure and release. You can see in a wrist whether someone is careless with weight. A patient wrist is straight and calm, the work happening along bones rather than in the panic of tendons. Songs grow to match good posture. A hauling song that rises too fast invites yanking. A low, loping tune invites better lifting. The village keeps its dignity by keeping its tools clean. A bucket that returns to ground sits on a little mat or on a low stool. That way, it never invites dust to climb inside. Lids exist for a reason beyond insects. They declare that pauses are intentional. A covered bucket is not a neglected bucket. A covered well says, "We have decided to draw later, and the water will be just as ready then." Civility reaches the rope, too. No wrapping it around a wet post where rot will begin. No tying it to a metal spike that will eat fibre in a month. Children are scolded gently for letting the rope twang. That instrument is tuned for labour, not for a passing giggle. Deep wells and city wells require complications that rural minds also understand instinctively. Alignment matters, because a bucket that skims stone pays tomorrow's masonry bill. So the roller's axis is set square to the shaft, the beam is braced against a clean, plumb post, and a tiny string and pebble serve as a plumb bob to approve the geometry. In taller cities, where wells reach far down, the pulley becomes a neat stack, double sheaves allowing two ropes to share a burden. The mathematics is as simple as bread. If a bucket weighs too much to lift once, lift half of it twice. Split the work. Arrive with dignity rather than drama. The machinery's loudest enemy is boredom, which invites shortcuts. So the community wraps maintenance in small, almost ceremonial acts. On the first day of the month, the roller is removed, wiped, and replaced. The rope is reversed end to end so the wear line becomes new territory. The bucket's banding is tapped. On the first day after rain, the coping stone is washed because grit uninvited to the lip is grit uninvited to the rope. In some towns, the well has a small book hung in a bag, no pen and ink, maybe just a set of carved notches, recording when the last oiling occurred and who sang what song while doing it. Care is memory you can touch .t the irrigated edge of the village. Water lifting becomes a long persuasion rather than a short heave. A row of shaduffs placed stepwise along a canal can walk water up a gentle hill, each beam accepting what the last beam offered. A chain of buckets can tilt a field into green in the way a loom tilts thread into cloth. Minute additions across an hour that become plenty across a day. Children learn the arithmetic of yield in their bones. 9 cups and a pause. 9 more and a rest. Then a change of hands. Repeat until shade shifts. That arithmetic becomes adult prudence. No one rushes a wheel that is meant to last a decade. No one sprints with a bucket that must make 5 trips. Materials whisper their limits. Wood would like not to split. Iron would like not to rust. Rope would like not to be abraded. The well lining would like not to be chipped. In a generous year, the village spends a little on better metal for the axle ends, and 2 old men argue amicably about whether oak or acacia is kinder to bearings. In a lean year, ingenuity replaces money. A strip of soft leather becomes a washer. A slice of horn becomes a shim. A smooth river stone becomes a bearing face. Nothing is waste if it can be turned into a smaller friction. When the sky is stingy, wisdom turns upward. A cistern begins not below your feet but above your head, with eaves and tiles and gutters patiently learning the shape of a storm. In places where the year is more blue than grey, people coax every visiting cloud into becoming months of quiet cups. They do it without magic, only with attention, plaster, and the humility to admit that the cleanest water is the rain you treat as a guest from the first hello. First comes the choreography of surfaces. A roof is more than shade. It is a listener. The pitch directs how quickly raindrops gather courage and run. A tile, with its small hollow, catches, releases, catches again, so the flow thickens into a thread. Wooden shingles whisper water along the grain. Palm thatch slows it like a sieve so dust has time to settle out of the way. The eave line grows a lip, and from that lip, a gutter hangs as neatly as an instrument in its case. Gutters are swept as often as courtyards are. A long-handled palm broom becomes a morning ritual, bristles stroking dry leaves into a basket so that the first rain does not taste like last month's wind. The first rain of a season is hospitable but not pure. It remembers the summer, yellow powder from flowers, fine grit from roads, the brief sooty signatures of cook fires carried as smudges on the breeze. To honour both the rain and the tongue, people invented a small grace, a first flush diverter. It can be very humble, just a jar set beneath a short branch of pipe, but it is eloquent in what it refuses. The first minutes of a storm, the water goes there, brownish and impatient, until it runs clearer. A child, puffing with importance, pulls a plug or tips a latch. Now the main pipe is allowed to speak to the cistern. The jar is entered into the herb bed, when no one minds murk. The diverter is rinsed. The sky's middle act is kept. Then there is the quiet art of the tank itself. Digging a cistern involves both excavation and promise. The hole is not the thing. The liner is the thing. Old builders knew lime as a living material. Slaked and rested, mixed with clean sand, sometimes fed with brick dust or volcanic powder, it cures slowly into a skin as patient as bone. Inside a cistern, hands float across curves rather than angles. Corners invite stagnation. Curves invite circulation. Workers burnish the last coat with a smooth stone, pressing the lime's will to close its own pores, to become less hospitable to seepage and to the small green ambitions of algae. In hot climates, the plaster is never urged to cure under noon's glare. Shade and time do the work, and a damp cloth laid across a wall becomes a prayer that the lime will knit itself properly. Because darkness is a defense, light is denied. The mouth of a cistern wears a lid like a good hat, solid, close-fitting, sometimes wrapped in cloth to hush any chattering wood. A small inspection opening is allowed, no bigger than a plate, and even that is kept covered except for the short rituals of checking and drawing. Steps are cut into one wall, shallow, curved to match the belly of the tank, so that a person can descend without muddling the floor. The floor slopes invisibly. Toward a sump, a little pocket where silt is allowed. To gather and be removed without. Disturbing the whole, water enters not as a shout but as a whisper through a calming box, a small chamber at the inflow where the energy of the drop is spent against a baffle. The box accepts the pipe's hurry and teaches it deliberation. From there, the water moves into open space with minimal disturbance. If no baffle exists, stones are laid beneath the inlet like a quiet shield to break the fall, so the cistern stays a mirror rather than a muddy memory. At the outlet, the spigot is set a hand's breadth above the floor so that the last inch of sediment is left for maintenance day rather than for anyone's cup. The house learns a new calendar around this pool below the floor. After a rain, there is a joy that feels like thrift rather than excess. People say, "We'll wash the blankets this week," or "Let's soak the jar seals and re-rubber them." The cook smiles at the clear pour and decides to make the kind of rice that demands fastidious water. For a time, tea tastes almost like the first crisp evening after summer, delicate, a little mineral, with no edge. Then the season advances, and the household becomes careful. The dipping is fixed at dawn and again at dusk. Noon is avoided. The water is cooler when the day is not staring. A small ladle keeps anyone from scooping with a hand. The lid is learned like a habit. It is lifted, set aside with a soft clack on the same folded cloth, and replaced without drama. An inventory of cups becomes an ethic of cups. Everything rinsed, everything returned to its hook. Public life organizes itself around larger cisterns the way it organizes itself around shade. In a stone town, the square's paving is not flat but very slightly persuaded. Rain is guided toward gratings that lead to the municipal belly beneath the bathhouse or the council hall. Civic cisterns are braver. Wider spans, vaulted ceilings, columns rising from the water's edge like cooled candles. You can clap once and hear the room answer. Guilds are formed to maintain them, and the rules sound less like law and more like careful gossip. Don't bring soap near the vent. Don't rinse skins on the steps. Sweep the roof before the storm threatens. Keep the first flush jars standing upright, not lounging like sleepy barrels. Maintenance is a kindness repeated so often it becomes invisible. Lime is touched up when it shows hairline crazing. No panic, just a thin wash and a week of patience. The sump is cleaned on a quiet morning. 2 people agree on signals, one up, one down, so the buckets pass without slosh or surprise. If a frog finds its way in, creatures always do, the story is told with a smile, and the response is measured. Draw down to the spigot, pour that water for the potted fig and the rosemary. Scrub the steps. Let the tank rest. Refill with the next rain. In places where drought is a regular guest, people learn to listen to water as if it breathes. A nose can tell if the cistern is content. It should smell like stone and shadow, not like pond or pantry. Ears can tell, too. A good cistern has a velvet echo, not a hollow ring. Health hides in these quiet distinctions. Algae are kept sleepy by darkness. Inlet screens are kept small enough to turn away insects and curious lizards, but large enough to shed clogging grit when a broom touches them. The spigot, often brass or pottery with a simple cork, is cleaned like a teacup. No one dips feet on a hot afternoon, no matter how inviting the shade. The cool is meant to be drunk, not worn. Children learn that clarity is earned as much as given, and that the cleanest water is not the water you see, but the water you protect. Architecture stretches to honor the cistern. Vines are trained across pergolas above the tank's domain, their leaves lifting heat away like slow fans. A fig trellis casts dappled shade, and there is a bench where an old man can sit with his back to the cool wall and tell stories. Kitchen sink ajar stand near the spigot, with a small stone channel that catches drips and leads them across a breath of time planted in a terracotta trough. The garden becomes an essay in reuse. The last cups of the day rinse the mortar and then say hello to parsley. The water from washing rice greets the lemon. The rinse from the teapot wakes basil. Every small generosity returns as flavor. In dry months, the cistern becomes a teacher of proportion. Guests are welcome, but their cups are smaller. Laundry is a matter of timing. Wool on the day after a storm, linens when the forecast speaks kindly. Buckets sit on wooden platforms so they do not pick up dust from the floor and carry it back into the pool. If someone spills, the scold is gentle. A cloth appears. The lesson is soft but permanent. Out in the lanes, conversations develop a new politeness. People speak of clouds without complaining to them. They say, "When the wind shifts, we'll sweep," and "The barrel at the east corner wants a new band," and "The bath next week, if the cistern smiles." In island towns, the sky and sea conspire to demand cisterns. Wells take in a taste of salt in such places, and the aquifer sulks under too much attention. So roofs wear cisterns the way sailors wear faith. Whitewash keeps heat from inciting algae. Rain chains clink like small clocks. Cistern water becomes the axis around which days turn. On cliffs that face trade winds, builders tuck tanks into the lee, out of the sea's angry reach. In the mornings, people compare echoes the way others compare market prices. "Ours is half," someone says, tapping the lid with a knuckle. "Ours is singing still," replies another, and you can hear a smile in the verb. Cisterns shape festivals as much as scarcity shapes manners. When the first storms of the season arrive, folks put jars out like drums to feel the rhythm, and then they bring them in again, because they trust the hidden pull more than any open mouth. Bakers plan sugar syrups for cakes when the cistern is generous. Dyers schedule vats. Plasterers volunteer to recoat the bathhouse vault, while the town can spare a week of settling water. Even the bell ringer listens. In dry months the bell rings slower, conserving sound the way the people conserve liquid. The town's tempo follows the cistern's breath. Afternoon heat lies across the village like a sleeping animal. The air wavers above the lane, and in the quiet, people talk about water the way sailors talk about wind, not as a luxury but as a grammar of survival. A mother notes the greener fleck in a thorny shrub down in the shallow gully. A shepherd remembers where flies swarm lazily but never land. Something cooler rises there. An elder points out how ants make a straighter line at dusk on one side of the path than on the other, as if they know a shortcut threaded by moisture. The first well doesn't begin with a spade. It begins with attention. A foot scuffs a test patch. A boy kneels to smell the soil. A circle is marked with cord and stick, not as a promise but as a question to the earth. May we open a mouth here, and will you let it drink? They start with a trial pit, a few careful shovel bites, then baskets pass palm to palm, and a patient sorting of what comes up. Powdery loam that smears into the lines of a hand. Grit that chafes and tumbles. A stubborn chalky layer that squeals under the iron and dulls it. Then, perhaps, the first cool breath. The air in the hole softens, and when they stop working, a faint mineral scent lingers, the way a cellar remembers fruit after the fruit is gone. Someone ties a knot in the rope to mark the depth where the smell changed. Someone else says, "We'll go wider," and will go slow. There is a method to widening, and it is older than writing. The circle's throat must not crumble. They place stones shaped by the river decades earlier, leaning one into the next, fitting faces so that each takes a share of worry. Where the soil loosens, they smear a clay slurry into the seams and press it with rounded pebbles, polishing as if they were finishing a cup. The well's mouth, a coping ring, rises one course at a time. Smooth as a turned bowl, meant to keep hooves and hurried feet honest. To keep dust from falling in, to become a rim that invites both respect and closeness. Children are warned to sit, not stand, and to keep their chatter soft, as if the well is a sleeping guest. The rope is not just rope. It is rule. It is dried after every busy morning. It is never dragged across grit where sand grains can bite into fibers and sour tomorrow's failure. It is pulled along a wooden roller so the stone edge does not become a slow, destructive file. Where the roller squeaks, someone pauses to touch a thumb of oil to the axle. This small mercy saves 100 future pulls. The bucket is not just a bucket. It is a promise that water will meet the lip of a jar gently. Coopered staves are kept tight with wedges. The handle bail checks so knuckles won't pinch as it pours. Clay jars balance in slings, carried in rhythm with the path stones. A dipper lives beneath a lid and is rinsed before and after each use. The motion is habitual as blinking. The well, quietly, trains the town to think forward. Kitchens drift upwind. Latrines are nudged downhill and farther away, their drainage made to seek a different destiny. The tannery learns to keep its fierce chemistry under a tiled linter, with a gutter that asks the dye to settle before it sees the street. A bathhouse is told to draw from the far channel, so laundry soap never tastes like drinking water. Without speeches or laws, the well draws a map of good behavior, and the village redraws itself in answer. Listen long enough and the well begins to speak. In spring, you hear generous tappings and the quick rope song of a bucket that rises full and fast. In late summer, you hear fewer pulls, a longer mutter of rope, and the careful clack of an empty pail lowered for a long search before the delicate thud of contact. In a dry year, people shorten their greetings at the rim. Work crews gather before dawn. Lamps and chisels go down, and the steps become measured. Chip, pause, breathe the heavy coolness, chip again. Dust rises in a slow column, then settles on shoulders like flour. A hummed melody times the hall, keeping muscles from rushing beyond prudence. When the pick opens a seam that sweats, the sound changes. You can hear relief in the bucket's weight and in the laughter that climbs up after it. Ritual grows where necessity lingers. A new bride's first duty might be a ladle for the eldest widow. Children are taught to taste only after the others, to learn that thirst is shared and solved together. On the year's coldest mornings, the first bucket rings with thin plates of ice, and the steam from a clay jug looks like ghost breath. On such days, even the impatient lift carefully, as if the water might shatter. Traveller's news arrives in chapters, the teller drawing out the story while helping pull, leaving the best part for when the bucket returns brimming. A well is a stage and a sanctuary, a workbench and a wishing place. People lean into its shade and into one another. And the day's troubles seem soluble, not because they vanish, but because a rope can hold weight and a human voice can turn counting into a tune. Maintenance is a quiet hero. The coping stone gets wiped with a damp cloth to clear granules before they can become a cycle of scratches. The rope is reversed end to end once a season, so wear evens out. The roller's groove is watched, not too deep, not a trap. A lid rests upon the mouth at noon when the wind plays with grit and at dusk when insects wake. If a frog is found floating, the water is drawn off to the herb patch. The well is scrubbed by two careful souls with soft brushes and patience, then allowed to settle, its dignity restored overnight. Everyone learns that a small mistake at the rim can become a large problem at the bottom, and so the rim becomes a classroom where courtesy is taught by example. Scarcity teaches a conscience of drops. The last inch at the bottom holds sediment, and nobody takes it unless they are cleaning. That inch belongs to tomorrow's clarity. Splashing is not mischief. It is information. If the same tile always gleams with puddles, someone lays a narrow stone channel leading toward time and mint so the waste becomes flavor. If a child is too quick with the pour and loses a cup to haste, an elder says nothing, just lifts slower and steadier. Showing that grace is a kind of technology. The well also keeps a community's private archive. There are grooves in the stone that match hands no longer alive. There is a darker patch where the midwife once leaned in 100 hurried nights. There is a chip on the coping where a soldier's sword knocked when he finally came home and got careless with joy. The village reads these as a book, not loudly, but by touch and by habit. A stranger arriving at dusk can read the well too. It is lidded, which means the town cares. The rope is clean, which means they are not desperate. The roller is smooth, which means someone thinks ahead. The stranger sleeps easier under such signs, even the well's shadow plays its part. In a broad, cobbled square, the shade moves like the hour hand of a clock, and people learn to time their chores so the pull happens in coolness. When children are sent to fetch, they are told to go before the shadow reaches the bakery's door, and they learn to judge the quiet sundial with a glance. The well becomes a teacher of time that neither scolds nor boasts, only traces patience across stone that I in the end. The first well is not truly first. It is the visible tip of an older conversation with the ground. People come and go, but the conversation continues. Lift, pour, protect, thank. You can stand at the rim with your eyes closed and hear how the lesson travels, from the lips of stone down through rings of careful masonry, past the dove-cool air that kisses your knuckles, into the earth-stored dark, where slow water waits without anger or hurry. The lesson is modest and profound at once. We do not conquer thirst. We practice outlasting it together. The well does not preach. It just stands there, level and clean, while rope and muscle and habit keep remaking community, a bucket at a time.